My name is Aline Sanches, and I'm 33 years old. You probably wouldn't recognize me in a crowd. I'm not the loudest. I'm not the most dramatic. I'm the kind of woman who learned early how to take up as little space as possible, how to survive without being seen. Before I tell you what happened and how everything changed, don't forget to like this video, comment where you're watching from, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps stories like mine be heard. Now, let me begin. I grew up in a house where people smiled for photographs but not for each other. The table was always set, but no one ever asked how I was doing. I was fed, I was clothed, but I was never felt. Not really. I became the background to my own childhood, a quiet observer of a family that never noticed when I was hurting. Some people are raised with love. I was raised with structure. Every emotion had a time limit. Every tear had to be logical. Every moment of softness was seen as weakness. My parents weren't cruel. That would have been easier to name. They were cold, distant, efficient. Their version of parenting was transactional. Grades, achievements, performances. You were valued by what you did, not by who you were. And I was the quiet one, the easy one, the one they didn't have to worry about. So they didn't. As the years passed, I learned to carry myself like a secret. I learned how to disappear without leaving the room. I got good at silence, so good that I started confusing it with peace. But silence isn't peace. It's a pressure cooker with no release. By the time I turned 18, I had already mastered invisibility. I moved out with a suitcase and a half-hearted hug from my father. There was no warning, no sadness, no attempt to keep me close. Just a quick good luck as he checked his phone. That should have broken me, but it didn't. It freed me. Because sometimes the only way to survive is to realize no one is coming to save you, and then become the person who does. I got a scholarship to study architecture. I worked 2 jobs and slept less than I should have. I skipped parties. I didn't date. While other girls were falling in love and breaking hearts, I was learning how to budget groceries and pay bills on time. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. And slowly, quietly, I built a life. Not the kind of life that made headlines, but the kind of life that was stable, steady, safe. I rented a small apartment with a balcony just big enough for 3 plants. I chose each one carefully, plants that needed light and attention but could survive a little neglect. Like me, I started designing homes that felt like what I never had, places where people could breathe, where memories could bloom without fear. Every blueprint I created felt like a quiet rebellion, a refusal to let cold walls define a childhood ever again. But even as I built a life away from them, the shadow of abandonment never left me. Because emotional neglect doesn't always scream. Sometimes it whispers for decades. I didn't speak to my parents for years. There were no calls, no holidays, no guilt, just distance. At least, not at first. But abandonment doesn't end when you walk away. Sometimes it chases you into adulthood. Sometimes it hides behind your own reflection. In every choice you make, there's a quiet voice asking, "Am I enough now?" I buried that voice under success. Promotions, awards, the quiet applause of being dependable. But I never truly answered it. Not until the day the phone rang. It was a Thursday. I remember because Thursdays used to be grocery day. I had my keys in one hand, a tote bag in the other, when I saw the screen light up, a number I didn't recognize. I should have ignored it, but something in me didn't. That call didn't change everything. It just reminded me of what I thought I had buried. A voice on the other end, polite and vague, told me my father was sick. My mother was overwhelmed, and that they, after all these years, had asked for me, not by name, just for help. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't a confession. It was a request. Casual, as if I had been waiting in the wings for my cue. But I wasn't a standby character anymore. I was the author now. Still, I didn't hang up. I listened, not because I cared, but because I wanted to feel something: anger, sadness, even pity. But all I felt was distance, not hatred, not love, just clarity. That was the moment everything began to shift, not because I answered their call, but because I didn't. There's a strange kind of ache that follows you when you've spent your life being ignored. It doesn't shout or bleed, it lingers, like an echo you hear when no one else does. I didn't realize how deeply it shaped me until I stopped answering the phone. In the quiet that followed, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt exposed. It's easy to confuse distance with healing. But ignoring a call isn't the same as letting go. And silence, though it had once been my shield, was beginning to feel like a cage. I spent that weekend cleaning the apartment like I was scrubbing the past out of the tiles. I rearranged the furniture. I repotted the plants. I changed the scent of the candles I lit at night. It was all subtle, nothing drastic, but it felt like reclaiming a space my history had quietly invaded. Sometimes letting go starts with moving the couch. Other times, it starts with admitting that even when you're no longer the child who waited for love, you're still learning not to expect it. I learned to stop asking for love when the answer was always indifference. I learned to celebrate alone, to cry into pillows instead of shoulders. I became self-sufficient, not out of strength, but necessity. That's the part no one tells you. Independence isn't always empowering. Sometimes it's just the result of being left alone too many times. Still, something shifted after that fourth voicemail. Not in me, but around me. The air felt heavier. My chest felt tighter, as if the past was sitting just outside the door, waiting to be let in. So I did what I always did when emotions threatened to unravel me. I went back to work. Design has always been my anchor. A world where chaos could be measured, where everything had a place, lines made sense, angles behaved, and every room I designed was another attempt to build the home I never had. That week, I took on a new project, a nursery, for a couple expecting their first child. They were nervous, excited, full of life and hope, and everything I had once thought was unreachable. As I listened to them describe the warmth they wanted to create, I felt something sharp press against my ribs. Not envy, grief. Not for what I lacked now, but for what I never received. They were building a world of softness for their child, while I had been raised among glass and cold concrete. After the meeting, I sat in my car for a long time, parked beneath a tree that had already begun to lose its leaves. I watched them fall, one by one, and thought about all the versions of myself I had shed. The little girl who stood in doorways, waiting to be invited in. The teenager who stopped asking questions because no one listened to the answers. The woman who had learned to smile at empty seats and call it peace. And now, the survivor. Quiet, composed, but no longer begging. It was strange, mourning someone who still lived. Mourning parents who were never truly gone, just never fully present. But grief isn't always about death. Sometimes, it's about acceptance. Acceptance that the version of them I needed never existed. That no reunion could undo the years of emotional drought. That sometimes, moving forward means leaving people exactly where they are, in your past. I drove home that night without the radio on, just the hum of the tires and the rhythm of my own breath. I didn't cry. I didn't smile. I just was. And that, I realized, was progress. Being able to exist without reacting, to feel the pain without feeding it, to sit in the discomfort without trying to make it disappear. Healing, I had once thought, would be a thunderclap, a moment of triumph. But it wasn't. It was quiet, steady, a whisper, not a roar. And in that silence, I found something I hadn't expected. Strength. Not the kind people admire in speeches. the kind that grows in private, that blooms without applause. The next morning, I opened my inbox and found another message. This time, not a voicemail, not a plea, but a letter from a lawyer. Formal, cold, just like them. Apparently, my parents were facing the loss of more than just their home. There were debts, lawsuits, and a request for my assistance. Legally phrased, professionally distant. No signatures, just typed names at the bottom. Even in collapse, they couldn't bring themselves to reach out like human beings. I read the letter twice, then a third time. And for the first time in a long while, I laughed. Not because it was funny, but because the absurdity of it all had finally broken the last thread of guilt I didn't know I was still holding. They hadn't changed, but I had. And that, I decided, was enough. I wasn't angry with my parents, not anymore, but that didn't mean I owed them anything. Forgiveness, I learned, is not an invitation to re-enter. It's a quiet decision to stop bleeding. Still, they kept calling. 3 voicemails by Monday. One marked urgent, another simply said, please. But urgency is not an apology, and please is not a promise. I deleted them all, not out of malice, but because I had nothing left to give. I thought about who I used to be, the version of me who would have answered on the first ring, who would have felt her stomach twist with guilt, who would have wondered if maybe this time things would be different. That version of me had been soft, not weak, just unprotected. And that softness had been crushed by years of quiet dismissals, forgotten birthdays, and invisible wounds. No one ever hit me. But absence leaves bruises too. I didn't reply to the lawyer's letter. Not because I didn't know what to say, but because I finally understood that saying nothing was the most honest response I could give. There's a moment in healing that no one prepares you for. It doesn't look like a victory or a celebration. It looks like quiet clarity, like standing in front of something that used to unravel you and feeling nothing. I expected guilt. I expected shame. But they didn't come. What came instead was stillness. And in that stillness, I saw myself. Not the daughter. Not the disappointment. Not the backup plan. Just Aline. The kind of woman who'd once searched for worth in hollow places, who'd once molded herself into whatever shape would earn the smallest acknowledgement. But now, she had stopped bending, and the world for once didn't collapse, because pain, even when it's destructive, is familiar. It gives structure. It gives meaning. Letting it go means rebuilding from scratch, with nothing but your own voice to guide you. One night, as I stood in the kitchen chopping vegetables, a song came on the radio. One I hadn't heard in years, the kind my mother used to hum when she was cleaning, lost in her own world. The melody tugged at something in me, something old and soft and buried. I froze, and for a split second, I felt her presence. Not the woman she was, but the mother I once imagined she could be. A mother who noticed, who cared, who asked questions and remembered birthdays and looked at me with something other than quiet dismissal. But the song ended, and so did the illusion. I stood there, still holding the knife, and realized that memory is not always a path. It's a loop, a trick of the mind that pulls you back just far enough to make you wonder if maybe, just maybe, you got it wrong. But I hadn't. They had, and no song could change that. That night, I didn't cry. I lit a candle. I sat by the window. I watched the lights flicker across the street. And I gave myself permission to miss what never was. Not because it was real, but because I had needed it so badly that part of me still believed it could have existed. Grief, I learned, isn't only for what we've lost. It's also for what we never had. And as I sat there in the quiet, I finally let go of the question that had haunted me since I was a child. What did I do wrong? The answer, now clear and unwavering, was simple. Nothing. I had never been the problem. I had just been the mirror, the one that reflected what they refused to see in themselves, their failures, their emptiness, their inability to love in any language other than control. And when I stopped reflecting that, they turned away. That's the thing about people who live in denial. They don't want truth. They want compliance. They want silence dressed as forgiveness. But I wasn't silent anymore. I was free. Still, freedom doesn't come without loneliness. There were nights when the weight of solitude pressed against my ribs, when the idea of being unanchored in the world made me feel small, unmoored. But those moments passed, and each time they did, I grew steadier, not colder, just clearer. I started journaling again, not about them, but about me. My mornings, my thoughts, my favorite teas, the small joys that had once been overshadowed by emotional survival. And in those pages, I met myself. Not the version created by trauma, but the one who had always been underneath. Curious, quietly hopeful, resilient in ways that had nothing to do with endurance and everything to do with grace. I stopped checking my phone obsessively. I stopped waiting for closure, because I realized that closure isn't something others give you. It's something you give yourself. And I gave it, in silence, in honesty, in letting the past stay where it belonged. By the end of that month, I walked past a bakery where I used to go as a child, a place where my father had once bought my sister a cake after a recital I wasn't allowed to attend. The sign had faded. The windows were fogged. I didn't go in. I just stood there for a moment, breathing in the sweet, stale air of memory. And then I walked away. Not bitter, not broken, just done. And that, I realized, was healing. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just a quiet decision made over and over to choose peace over permission, to choose self-respect over guilt, to choose life, even if it means walking alone. In the days that followed, the silence stretched like a horizon. No more calls, no more voicemails, no more formal requests in passive-aggressive language. It was as if they had finally accepted the truth, one they had avoided their entire lives, that I was no longer available, not emotionally, not financially, not even as an idea. They hadn't just lost access to me, they'd lost the version of me who would have kept showing up even when she wasn't seen. I still went to work, still cooked dinner, still took walks through the park near my apartment. Life didn't change dramatically, but it felt different, like I was finally the one holding the pen, writing each moment instead of reacting to someone else's story. The hardest part of healing, I discovered, isn't cutting ties. It's learning how to exist without the weight you used to carry. Somewhere between forgetting their voices and remembering my own, I began planting again. Not just flowers, not just herbs, but intentions. It started with a single pot on the windowsill, a lavender sprig, thin and hesitant, bending toward the light like it had a question to ask. I watered it gently, every morning, not because I needed it to grow, but because I needed to remember that care could exist without conditions. The old version of me had only known care as currency. Do this, and you'll earn a smile. Be quiet, and you might be allowed to stay. Say thank you, and you won't be reminded of what it cost. But this time, I gave with no expectation. And the lavender grew. People talk about blooming like it's beautiful, and it is, but they forget it's also messy. Rooting hurts, expanding stretches, and sometimes growth feels like being torn open. But I kept planting. Aloe, rosemary, sweet mint. I sat down with that photo for a long time. Not to cry, not to mourn, but to witness her, to say, without speaking, I see you now, and I'm sorry no one did then. She didn't disappear after that. She lingered, in the way I now paused before reacting, in the way I no longer explained myself to people who didn't care to listen, in the way I chose what to carry and what to leave behind, and most of all, in the way I protected myself, not with walls, but with boundaries. You see, boundaries aren't fences, they're gardens. You don't build them to keep people out. You plant them to remind yourself that what grows here matters. One evening, I was invited to a small gathering at a coworker's house. Nothing fancy, just music, a few drinks, and unfamiliar faces. The old version of me would have declined. Too tired, too anxious, too unsure of where she fit. But I went. I brought homemade bread. I wore earrings I hadn't touched in years. I laughed, not to fill the silence, but because something was genuinely funny. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like a stranger to the moment I was living. No one there knew my history. No one there knew the years of absence, the silent childhood, the phone calls unanswered. They just knew Aline. And she was enough. It's funny how long we carry shame for things we didn't cause. How long we believe we're unlovable simply because no one showed us love the way we needed it. But life has a way of circling back with gentle reminders that it's never too late to be seen differently. And that sometimes the person who sees you best is you. After the party, I walked home alone. The streets were quiet, the wind soft. I passed a bakery with warm lights and humming from inside. I stopped, not to go in, but to watch the people at the tables. Two women talking with their hands, a man reading alone, smiling at the page, a teenager biting into something sugary, eyes closed. It wasn't jealousy that I felt. It was a sense of possibility, that life could be ordinary and still good. That joy didn't have to be earned with pain. That maybe, just maybe, I didn't need to rewrite the past. I only needed to stop dragging it into the present. When I reached my apartment, the lavender plant had bloomed, soft purple, resilient, beautiful in its quiet way. And I realized that this too was my story, not the one they left me with, the one I chose. A story of silence turned sanctuary, of being forgotten and still remembering who I am, of growing things even when the soil has known drought. And for the first time, I didn't feel like I was surviving. I felt like I was beginning. Every leaf was a lesson. Every morning, a reminder that consistency is stronger than grand gestures, that showing up again and again, even for yourself, is the truest form of love. I didn't share any of this. No social media updates, no celebratory photos, just the quiet life of someone who had finally stopped performing. And maybe that's the real revenge, not success or vindication, but peace that needs no audience. One day, I found an old box while cleaning the closet. It was small, untouched for years. Inside, a pile of journals, crumpled letters never sent, and a photograph I thought I'd lost. A picture of me at 12, standing near the school gate, holding a ribbon I'd won in art class. No one came that day to see me win. The photo had been taken by a teacher, not my family. And in my 12-year-old eyes, I saw something I hadn't expected. Hope. Not just the longing kind, but the defiant kind. The kind that survives even when nothing else does. It had been 11 years since I last saw the house, the one with the narrow driveway, the chipped white gate, and the garden that had always looked more like an afterthought than a sanctuary. I wasn't sure why I went. There was no letter, no phone call, no invitation, just a pull, not nostalgia, not curiosity, closure. I took the early train and arrived just after sunrise, before the city had fully opened its eyes. The street was quiet, except for a few birds and the soft, predictable hum of routine. Everything looked smaller, or maybe I had simply outgrown the scale of that world. The house, unsurprisingly, was empty. Windows dark, curtains drawn. The mailbox hung open as if even it had given up waiting. I stood across the street and watched. I didn't move. I didn't cross. I just looked, and it was enough. As I walked down the street, I passed the corner store where my sister used to beg for candy, the park where I once watched other kids play from the bench, the bus stop where I stood countless mornings, invisible in plain sight. These places hadn't changed, but I had, and walking through them felt like visiting a life I had read about, not one I had lived. That afternoon, I found a small cafe nearby, one I didn't recognize. New owners, new windows, new life in a place that used to be surrounded by silence. I ordered tea and sat by the window, letting the light fall across my face. A mother sat 2 tables away with her daughter, maybe 5 years old. She was tying the child's shoelaces with patient hands and a soft smile. The girl laughed, wiggling her foot, carefree in a way I never had been. I watched, not with envy, but with quiet hope. Hope that someone, somewhere, was rewriting what motherhood could look like, that not all children would grow up invisible, that not all daughters would spend decades trying to earn a glance that should have been freely given. And in that moment, I felt it again. Peace. Not the peace of resolution, not the peace of apologies received, but the peace of letting go, of realizing I could leave without answers, of knowing that absence doesn't always need to be filled. Sometimes it just needs to be honored. I pulled out my journal and wrote one line. I am not theirs anymore. And I wasn't. I paid the bill, left a small tip, and stepped back into the afternoon light. It was warmer now, the wind softer, the sky impossibly blue. And I realized I didn't need to come back here again. Not ever. Not even to remember. Because the version of me that had needed their love no longer existed. She had evolved into someone who knew how to water her own soil, into someone who no longer searched for closure in people who couldn't even offer honesty, into someone who, simply by surviving with softness intact, had already won. The train ride back felt different than the one before. I watched the trees blur past the window, the reflection of my face steady and unbothered. And for the first time in years, I didn't imagine what could have been. I honored what was, and more importantly, what is. I arrived home just as the sun began to dip. My apartment smelled like rosemary and fresh linen. The lavender was still blooming. The air was still mine. My life was still mine. I set down my bag, brewed a new cup of tea, and stood barefoot on the kitchen tiles. This was home now. Not a place built by others. Not a place filled with ghosts. But a place I had chosen. A place I had filled. A place I had grown. That night, I opened the journal again and added one more line below the first. I am mine now. And with that, I closed the book. Not to forget, but because there was nothing more to write about them. Strange how a place that once swallowed you whole can, in time, seem like nothing more than a worn-out shell. There had been a time when I'd thought the walls held meaning, echoes of laughter, arguments, silences so thick they became furniture. But that morning, they were just walls, weathered, unremarkable, silent in a different way. I closed my eyes and tried to remember the sound of my mother's heels across the tiles, my father's voice behind the newspaper, the hollow clang of plates being set for a dinner where I was too quiet to interrupt. The memories came, but with soft edges, no longer sharp, no longer dangerous, like touching something hot long after the fire's gone. I didn't cry. I didn't rage. I didn't feel much at all. And maybe that's what healing truly looks like, returning to the scene of the ache and realizing it no longer belongs to you. I turned away, not out of defiance, but because there was nothing left to take. Healing, I learned, doesn't always look like rebuilding. Sometimes it's just choosing not to return to what broke you. After that final visit to my childhood street, the world didn't shift dramatically. The skies didn't part. No poetic closure arrived wrapped in meaning. But something inside me stopped bracing for impact. The tension I carried in my shoulders, the guarded way I used to greet the day, those things started to loosen. Quietly, invisibly, gradually. I stopped checking my phone as often. Not because I was avoiding anything, but because I wasn't waiting for anything anymore. The silence I once feared had become something I welcomed. And not just silence from others, silence within myself. I no longer felt the need to defend the life I had chosen. Not to them. Not to anyone. Not even to the ghost of the girl I used to be. The one who whispered, "Are you sure this peace will last?" She had been with me for years. Watching, doubting, worrying that any sense of calm was a trap. But even she was quieter now. I started noticing things I'd missed for years. The way the wind played with the curtains at dusk. How jasmine smelled stronger after rain. The pleasure of warm socks pulled from the dryer. It sounds insignificant. But when your life has been built around bracing for rejection, these moments feel like miracles. I began cooking more. Not extravagant dishes. Just quiet meals that I plated for one and ate slowly. I started leaving the dishes until morning, because for once I didn't feel I had to prove anything by keeping everything spotless. I read books that had nothing to do with self-help. I painted a wall yellow. I rearranged the furniture for no reason. And in all of this, I never once thought about who might approve. I wasn't chasing transformation. I wasn't trying to become someone else. I was simply becoming someone I could live with. There's a certain freedom in not being consumed by what was denied to you, and an even greater freedom in realizing you don't owe your healing to anyone else's timeline. Friends began to notice a shift. They didn't always know what to call it, but they called it strength. I think it was just stillness. For the first time in decades, I wasn't strategizing how to be loved. I was simply showing up for myself. There were days that felt heavier than others. Of course there were. Memories still had their seasons, but even then, I stopped fighting them. I let them pass through. I let them leave when they were done. It reminded me of an old truth I had heard once but never believed. Not everything you feel has to be solved. Some things just want to be witnessed. I stopped narrating my pain to people who didn't know how to hold it. I stopped seeking redemption from the ones who never saw me clearly to begin with. Instead, I started writing again. Not for publishing, not for sharing. Just small notes. Letters I'd never send. Observations. Feelings. Hopes. One of them read, "I used to think my story was about what they did to me, but maybe my story is about what I did next." And what I did next was live, unremarkably, quietly, authentically. Not the kind of life that would be celebrated by anyone looking for a grand comeback, but the kind of life that felt like home. I planted herbs on my windowsill. I made Sunday a day for resting. I let laughter come without suspicion. And I stopped rehearsing conversations in my head where I finally said the right thing to people who no longer mattered. My worth was no longer a debate. It was a truth I carried like breath. Even the mirror changed. Where once I had seen someone trying so hard to be enough, I now saw someone who already was. And not in a dramatic way. Just in the quiet, stable way that self-recognition brings. I didn't need revenge. I didn't need reconciliation. I didn't even need understanding. I just needed the permission I had spent my whole life waiting for, and finally gave to myself. No one clapped, no one noticed. And yet, it was the loudest moment of my life. Because healing isn't just about the past losing its grip. It's about the present finally having your full attention. And mine did. For once, completely. Peace doesn't mean your story ends. It means you finally have space to write the next chapter. After months of silence, I started to notice something shift. Not in the world, but in me. The stillness I had carefully nurtured no longer felt like something to protect, but something I could build from. I wasn't afraid of the past anymore, but I also wasn't running from it. It simply sat beside me, quiet and familiar, no longer steering the wheel. One morning, as sunlight poured through the windows and danced across my kitchen floor, I opened my laptop without a plan. It was instinct. Something inside me nudging me forward. The cursor blinked on a blank document. And without knowing why, I began to write. I didn't write about my parents. I didn't write about the missed birthdays or the silences that cut deeper than words. I wrote about a woman who had learned to breathe without asking permission, about planting a garden when all she had known was drought, strangers who said they felt understood for the first time in years. I never expected it to matter, but it did. It wasn't fame. It wasn't viral. It was something better. Connection. I had spent so many years begging for love in places where it couldn't grow. Now, I was planting seeds in fertile soil, and they were blooming. But sharing your story, even gently, comes with its own kind of vulnerability. One afternoon, I received a message, not from a stranger, from someone I used to know, a childhood friend, someone who had seen my life from the outside and assumed it was perfect. Her message was short but heavy with emotion. She had read one of my posts. It had unlocked memories of her own, stories she had buried under decades of pretending. She thanked me, and in that moment, I realized something that shook me more than any betrayal ever had. Maybe my pain wasn't wasted. Maybe the life I had built wasn't just a recovery. It was a bridge, not back to the people who had hurt me, but toward the ones still trying to survive themselves. That realization wasn't comforting. It was sobering, because with it came a quiet responsibility. When you heal, people start watching, not because you owe them answers, but because your survival gives them permission to believe they might survive too. I wasn't sure I was ready for that. I had spent years learning how to hold myself. Now I was being asked to hold space for others. But maybe that was the point. Not to become a savior, not to become a spokesperson, just to be a reminder that silence isn't the end of the story, that peace can follow pain, that life can be gentle, even if it didn't start that way. So I kept writing. Not every day, not perfectly, just honestly. And with every word, I felt something rebuild, not just in me, but around me. I received letters, emails, messages from people whose stories didn't match mine, but whose wounds felt familiar. They didn't need advice. They needed to be seen. And in witnessing them, I began to understand the full weight of my own healing. It wasn't about closure. It wasn't about justice. It was about continuity, the choice to keep living, not despite the past, but alongside it. To make peace with the parts of you that still flinch, to love the version of yourself that once begged for crumbs, to welcome the life that shows up quietly, patiently, after the noise fades. That's what I had found. Not a happy ending, but a beginning I could trust. And with every new person who reached out, I remembered, I didn't survive for applause. I survived to live. And now, maybe, to help others do the same. About joy that arrived quietly, without an audience. I wrote for hours. When I stopped, I didn't feel exhausted. I felt awake, like I had finally exhaled something I'd been holding in for years. The next day, I wrote again, not to prove anything, not to process, but because something within me was ready to be shared. For weeks, I kept writing. Short essays, quiet truths, pieces of the life I was now living, not as a victim, but as someone who had rewritten the script. I didn't tell anyone at first. It felt too personal, too raw. But eventually, I created a blog, a small, quiet corner of the internet. No pictures, no name, just words. I uploaded a few pieces and closed the tab. It wasn't about being seen. It was about finally having something to say and trusting that whoever needed it would find it. To my surprise, they did. Slowly, people started leaving comments. Women who had grown up invisible, men who had never been allowed to grieve. It came as an email, just like the one that shattered my past. But this one wasn't from someone trying to warn me, it was from someone trying to lift me. The subject line was simple: "Would you speak at our gathering?" At first, I thought it was a mistake, an automated request, some generic outreach. But as I read, I realized it wasn't random. They had read one of my essays, the one about learning to breathe again without apology. The woman who reached out said my words had helped her through the end of a toxic marriage. She ran a small community organization, helping women rebuild their lives after emotional trauma. And they were hosting a weekend retreat in the countryside. She said they didn't want a professional. They wanted someone real, someone who had been through the quiet kind of pain. The pain that doesn't bruise your skin, but bruises the parts no one sees. She asked if I would come and share. Just a short talk. My story. I closed the email and stared at the wall, of the woman who sat on her bed, wondering if anyone would ever see her as more than a mistake. Of the girl who once counted how many days she could go without being spoken to in her own home. And then I thought of the woman I had become. The one who made her own meals, who painted her own walls, who no longer waited for invitations to exist. So when I replied, I kept it simple. Yes, I'll come. The weeks that followed moved slowly but with purpose. I prepared my talk, not as a performance, but as a letter to the woman I used to be. I wrote about the garden, the unanswered calls, the way peace arrived not with fireworks, but with the sound of rain on a quiet roof. And I wrote about the moment I realized healing didn't mean returning to the life that hurt me. It meant creating one that never would. When the day finally came, I packed lightly. Just a small bag, a notebook, and the courage I had earned through years of invisible work. The retreat was held in a refurbished farmhouse nestled between green hills. The air smelled like rosemary and soil. It was the kind of place that invited you to exhale. There were no crowds, no lights, just a circle of women who had gathered not to be fixed, but to be heard. When it was my turn to speak, I stood at the front of a room with open windows and worn wooden floors. I took a breath, and then another, and I spoke. Not about blame, not about villains, just about truth. I told them I wasn't the strong one growing up, that I had spent years believing love had to be earned through silence, that I once measured my worth in how little space I took up. I told them I had waited for an apology that never came. And then I stopped waiting. I told them healing isn't a finish line. It's a muscle. You build it slowly, with every boundary you honor, with every version of yourself you refuse to abandon. When I finished, the room was quiet. No applause. Just stillness, but it was the kind of stillness that held something sacred. Afterward, a woman approached me. She looked to be in her 50s. She had tears in her eyes, but her voice was steady. She said, "I've never spoken to anyone about my own story, but tonight, I think I will." That was it. Not a grand transformation, just a shift. And sometimes, a shift is all it takes. That night, as I lay in the small guest room with its creaky floor and soft blanket, I didn't feel nervous. I didn't replay my words in my head, worrying how they landed. I just felt present, and I understood something I hadn't before. Maybe healing isn't the end of the story. Maybe it's the invitation to help someone else begin theirs. For a long time, this wasn't something I had planned. I wasn't a speaker. I wasn't a therapist. I was just Aline, a woman who had survived, a woman who still sometimes looked over her shoulder when joy felt too easy. Could I really stand in front of others and speak as if I was whole? But then I realized something. I wasn't being asked to be perfect. I was being asked to be honest. And honesty was something I had learned to carry with care. Still, doubt crawled in. What if my voice trembled? What if I couldn't finish? What if no one saw value in what I had to say? But another thought whispered louder. What if it mattered? What if, in telling my story, someone else decided not to give up? What if the silence I broke became a doorway for someone else? That question stayed with me for days. I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I walked my garden in the early hours. I listened to the wind. I reread some of my oldest journal entries. I reminded myself of who I used to be. The road home felt different, not because the path had changed, but because I had. There's something about sharing your pain out loud that softens its grip. It doesn't erase it, but it loosens the knot it once tied around your ribs. As I drove through familiar hills and watched the sun break gently through the trees, I didn't feel the usual weight waiting for me. I felt calm. Not the kind that's forced, but the kind you earn, slowly, painfully, and honestly. My garden greeted me in silence. The wind had shifted the leaves, but the jasmine still climbed. The chair in the corner still faced east, toward the morning light. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel alone in that space. I felt accompanied by every woman I had met during the retreat. Women who carried invisible wounds like mine. Women who weren't broken, but brave. Quietly. Unapologetically. One afternoon, while organizing the books in my small reading room, I found a letter I had written to myself years earlier. It was tucked behind a photo I no longer displayed, the one of my family at a wedding I barely remembered attending. The letter wasn't long, but it was heavy. I had written it at a time when I felt invisible. It began with a question. Do you think they'd notice if you disappeared? I didn't cry when I read it. I didn't pity the woman who wrote it. I honored her. She was the one who survived long enough for me to arrive here. She was the version of me who whispered into the dark and hoped someone would answer, even if that someone turned out to be herself. I folded the letter back, but I didn't hide it. I placed it in a new box, beside my growing collection of essays and retreat notes. A reminder, not of pain, but of progress. That week, I received 2 more calls from numbers I didn't recognize. I didn't answer. I didn't even listen to the voicemails. Not out of anger, but out of peace. There's a moment in healing when you no longer need to open every door. Some can remain closed, gently, without resentment. And that's what growth looks like. The quiet choice to protect your peace over reopening old wounds. One morning, as I sipped tea on the porch, I received an email. Another invitation. This time, not to speak, but to write. A small publication focused on stories of resilience had come across my blog. They wanted to feature one of my essays. They said it would help others feel less alone. I didn't hesitate. Not because I felt confident, but because I knew the cost of silence. I sent them the piece I had written about rebuilding my life from the inside out, starting with the day I planted my first seed in the garden. A day when everything still felt hollow, but I chose to hope anyway. The editor replied within an hour. She said the story felt like sunlight through broken glass. That phrase stayed with me, because that's exactly how I saw my life now. Not flawless, not untouched, but beautiful because of what it had survived. As I walked back inside, the house felt warmer. Not physically, but emotionally. The shadows that once lingered in the corners had softened, not because they vanished, but because I had learned to live with them. I began writing more often, not for an audience, but for clarity. I wrote about small victories, like learning to fall asleep without overthinking, or walking past familiar pain without letting it define me. I wrote about what it meant to unlearn shame, to stop apologizing for taking up space, to stop measuring love by how much I sacrificed. Each word I wrote felt like reclaiming a part of myself, a voice I had once lost beneath years of conditional affection and unmet expectations. Eventually, I pinned a note to my wall. It said, "You are not the version they created. You are the version you chose to become." And I read it every morning. I knew I wasn't finished healing. I knew there would be days when the past still tugged at me. But I also knew this: I would never again abandon myself to be accepted by others. I had spent too long trying to earn love that should have been given freely. Now, I gave it to myself, daily, deliberately, without condition. And in doing so, I became someone worth coming home to. I unpacked slowly. No rush, no buzzing phone, no guilt. I placed my notebook beside my bed, like an old friend returning from a long walk. Then I opened the window and let the breeze move through the room, washing it clean with air that smelled like eucalyptus and new beginnings. That night, I didn't journal. I didn't plan. I simply existed. And for the first time in as long as I could remember, that was enough. In the days that followed, I went about life with a softness I didn't know I was capable of. My routines stayed the same: tea in the morning, walks through the market, trimming plants, but they felt different now. Less like a defense, more like a celebration. I wasn't hiding anymore. I wasn't waiting for someone to notice me. I had become the person I used to search for in others. There was one room in my house I never touched, not because it held memories, but because it didn't. It was the spare room, plain, empty. No furniture beyond an old chair left by the previous tenant. The kind of room you always tell yourself you'll use one day. For guests, for storage, for a version of your life you haven't quite defined yet. For me, it became a measure of time. The dust on the windowsill, the cracks in the ceiling, the way the sunlight carved sharp angles onto the wooden floorboards each morning. Everything in that room reminded me of the stillness I used to mistake for peace. Some days, I stood in the doorway, wondering if I should finally do something with it. But then I'd step back, because deep down, I knew it mirrored a part of me I wasn't ready to fill. I didn't see myself as someone with a story worth telling, not in a room full of women whose wounds had sharper edges, whose pasts had left visible scars. But something inside me stirred. Maybe it was that empty room. Maybe it was the version of myself who had stopped answering calls because she finally could. I said yes. The meeting was a week away. Plenty of time to prepare, or panic. Instead, I started with small things. I walked more, wrote less, let my tea get cold as I sat by the window, watching the wind push against the glass. I noticed how the air shifted when the jasmine bloomed just a little more. I cleaned out a drawer I hadn't touched in years and found an old envelope with no return address. I didn't open it. Some things are meant to stay closed. The night before the meeting, I finally entered the spare room. For the first time, I didn't just glance in. I stepped over the threshold, ran my fingers along the walls, pulled the curtain back and opened the window. The breeze that rushed in was cold, not unpleasant, but unexpected. It reminded me of a memory I had buried long ago, the time I left my childhood home with a single suitcase and no one watching. No goodbye, no promise, just departure. The room felt heavier than I remembered, and yet it was still just a room, just wood, paint, and time. Still, something inside me knew I would never again let it remain empty, not as a metaphor, not as a wound. I didn't decorate it that night. I didn't rush to fill the space. But I did sit in the chair, the old one left behind, and I let myself imagine. What would it feel like to fill a space with purpose? Not performance, not survival, but intention. The next morning came quietly. I dressed simply. No makeup, no script. On the way to the meeting, I passed 3 different women walking alone. One pushing a stroller, one carrying groceries, one with earbuds in, eyes distant. And I wondered if they too had rooms in their lives left untouched, stories they hadn't yet found the language to tell. The building was small, tucked between 2 bookstores. Inside, the circle was already forming, not formal, not stiff, just women, in chairs, holding stories inside their skin. No one asked for credentials. No one asked why I was there. They simply left a space open. And in that moment, I realized some of the most powerful healing begins when you stop being invisible in your own life. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't know where to start, so I told them about the room, the untouched space, the stillness, the dust. I told them about the phone calls I no longer answered, not out of anger, but because I had nothing left to prove. And slowly, without forcing it, I found myself telling pieces I hadn't planned to share, moments I hadn't written about, not out of shame, but because I hadn't yet lived them aloud. When I finished, no one clapped. No one offered solutions. They just nodded. And that silence, that acceptance, was the kindest sound I had ever known. That night, when I returned home, the air felt different. The jasmine had bloomed even more. The window in the spare room was still open, and for the first time, I didn't just see a room. I saw a beginning, not the final chapter, not closure, just the quiet inhale before something new. People talk about healing as if it's a journey with checkpoints, moments where you finally feel done. But what I've learned is that healing is more like circling a familiar neighborhood at a different time of day. The shadows shift, the air smells different, but you're still walking streets you know too well. That week, the calls started again. Not from my parents, not from anyone I once knew, but from a foundation I had applied to over a year earlier, a small nonprofit working with women who had survived familial neglect and emotional abandonment. I had written them a letter, not expecting a reply. Just the act of sending it had felt brave enough. Now they wanted to meet. The woman on the phone spoke gently, without urgency, as if she understood that my voice might still tremble under too much attention. She said they were offering me a chance to speak, to share my story in a closed circle, not for content, not for exposure, just for connection. I almost declined. There's a certain kind of peace that only comes after the storm you thought would never pass. Not because the damage is undone, but because you've learned to live beyond it. The days that followed the meeting were quiet, not the kind of quiet that stings like silence, but the kind that hums gently underneath everything, like a home settling into its own foundation after years of shifting. I found myself standing in the spare room more often, not as a visitor, not as someone testing the air, but as someone who belonged. I didn't decorate it right away. I didn't rush to buy furniture or hang pictures or fill the walls with something loud. Instead, I brought in a single candle, lit it at dusk, let it burn until the wick softened and folded into the wax. Some evenings, I sat on the floor beside it, no music, no phone, just breath and memory. And I realized something simple and staggering. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel like I was waiting, not for love, not for permission, not for an apology that would never come. That absence, that emptiness, used to feel like failure, but now it felt like space, a canvas, a beginning I hadn't known I was worthy of. It had been months since the last call from my parents, and by then, I had stopped expecting anything from that silence. It no longer echoed. It no longer pulled. until one envelope arrived, handwritten, my name on the front, no return address. I didn't open it immediately. I placed it on the kitchen counter and walked away. Not out of fear, but out of respect for the woman I had become. Later that night, I opened it, not because I needed answers, but because I no longer feared what I'd find. Inside was a single page. No apology, no explanation, just a line from my mother. A sentence that read more like a sigh than a confession. We didn't know how to love you. That was it. Nothing else. No signature, no date, just those words. And surprisingly, they didn't break me. They didn't validate me either. They just were. Because by then, I had stopped needing their love to measure my worth. By then, I had learned to give myself everything they couldn't. Softness, safety, solitude. And in that moment, I understood the final truth. Some people will never be what you needed them to be. Not because you weren't lovable, but because they were never taught how to give what they never received themselves. And while that explanation doesn't excuse the pain, it does release you from carrying it. So I folded the letter and placed it in a box I keep for things I no longer carry with me, but still honor. Like childhood photos, like old keys to apartments I no longer live in, like silence that no longer hurts. Weeks passed, then months. Seasons shifted. The jasmine in the garden climbed higher than ever, and I too grew. Not taller, not louder, just more rooted, more present, more real. One morning, I passed a little girl on the street. She was crying, dragging her backpack behind her as her mother pulled her forward in frustration. For a second, our eyes met, and in her face, I saw myself, not as a mirror, but as a memory. A girl who once believed that being unseen was the same as being unworthy. I smiled, a small gesture, one that barely moved the air, but I hoped it stayed with her, even if just as a whisper that she mattered, that she was not invisible. Because that, I've learned, is how healing passes forward, not always through grand acts or loud declarations, but through quiet presence, through showing up for others in the ways no one ever showed up for you. And that is where I'll leave you, whoever you are, wherever you're listening from. Not with a dramatic ending, not with revenge or regret, but with something softer, a room finally filled, a garden still growing, and a life that no longer waits for love it had to beg for. Thank you for walking this path with me. If this story touched you in any way, please don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Your presence here means more than you know. Have a blessed day. Thank you.